Hello, I'm Charles Mallet with a UK column interview. I have with me today Dr Mike Yeadon, who, among many other things, has a background in mechanistic toxicology. Mike sounded the alarm in 2020 with a klaxon horn and was almost immediately smothered in insulating foam of the densest kind by both the establishment and the mainstream media, making him one of the most censored and smeared men in the UK. Mike, a very warm welcome to UK Column, and thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Well, it's great to be speaking with you, Charles. Thanks for the invitation. And to the extent some of your audience might not know me or anything about me, I'm excited to have a chance to let them have some truth bombs, really.
Excellent. Well, on that note, and therefore, with where we're going to go in mind, which will definitely be into waters that might be described as rather choppy and certainly covering subjects that are still very controversial to this day, I think it's really important that we set out your professional background, specifically that within the pharmaceutical industry. So in summary form, would you just describe your passage through the pharmaceutical industry and indeed your qualifications that carried you through that process?
I went to university late for all sorts of reasons, but I went very committed at 21. I took a biochemistry and toxicology degree. It was a joint honours 4-year course. I was privileged to be assigned to work at secret establishments like Portland Down and also the Aldermaston Forensic Science HQ. So I had security clearance in the 80s. I was proud to say I got a very good first-class honours degree. And this is untypical of Brits to say this, but one of the people who gave me my certificate said this is the highest score in a 4-year degree ever awarded in this school of biological sciences. So the reason I worked so hard is because I screwed up really at school and couldn't go to university, and spent 2 of 3 years working outside with hard hat and steel toe cap boots, being a complete fish out of water. So I got to university, excited to seize the opportunity, and boy, I did. And then after that first-class honours degree, I took a PhD, so it's a training in the scientific method and applied training. And I studied I looked at respiratory pharmacology, the effects of drugs on respiration, and my specialty was what do opiate drugs like morphine do to breathing. What an amazing coincidence given what was to ensue in 2020. Got that PhD, and then I joined the pharmaceutical industry. I spent 7 years at what was then the Wellcome Research Labs, now part of GSK. And then after that, in 1995, I went to Pfizer, and there I spent the rest of my big pharma career. While at Pfizer, I became the most senior research person in the company, responsible for allergic and respiratory disease therapeutics. I left in 2011 because Pfizer was shrinking and closed its UK R&D base in Kent. And after that, I was 51, supremely fit. I'd taken on marathon running in the previous 8 years. And I thought, I don't want to try and get a job in a foreign country, because there were opportunities only to work in similar positions abroad. And so I'll decide to become an independent. I did have a couple of approaches from people whose companies I had evaluated as potential acquisition targets. I'd looked at about 100 companies, and a couple said, you did a very thorough job and nice to work with. Would you like to consult to our new biotech? So I got an introduction to biotech. Now, those are small private companies that hope to get bought by big behemoths or to float on the stock market and become darlings of the stock market and so on. So over the 2011 to 2020 9-year period, I consulted to about 30 biotechs, mostly private financed and mostly in the respiratory and inflammation area. Along the way, though, somebody who was an investor with one of my first clients said, well, what's happening to all the compounds you used to work on at Pfizer? And I said, well, they're probably going in the skip, in the dumpster, because Pfizer's shrinking, not just moving. And they said, you could raise a bit of money and spin those compounds out and make something happen. And that thought led 18 months later to the founding of a private company called Ziarco, Ziarco. And I was the founder and CEO, along with a couple of good colleagues from Pfizer. We spun out some compounds from Pfizer, raised a bit more money, and through hard work, luck, and good judgment, a mixture, we converted a very early stage compound into something that had passed clinical proof of concept. So it looked like it would work in a formal large trial. In brief, a bidding war, not inspired by me. I was just a technical describer, but supported by people who are old hands in how to make something attractive and to get a bidding war going. The bidding war started, and by, I think it was December 2016, Novartis and we signed an agreement to sell and they to buy. And so by early 2017, I made a decent chunk of money, and I went on to a position where I was just doing a little bit of light consulting because people asked me, and that continued till 2020. My wife is always keen that I should not say I'm a retired pharmaceutical company executive. I kind of am now. I've been retired because all of my clients fired me during summer 2020, saying it's nothing personal, but people are saying this conspiracy theory guy, you can't have him as an advisor, you can't have him on our board, get rid of him. So so that was the end. And from 2020, probably spring 2020 until the present day, I have done some work every day, often 12 hours a day in the early stages, attempting to warn people that what we were being told was not true. And for my pains, as you said, I have been smeared more in the past than the present, and censored. It's so strong, the censorship, that if it wasn't serious, it would be funny. So I cannot appear under my own name on any of the major platforms on the internet, social media, and so on. I'm allowed only, I can browse, I can send emails, and I can only post in my own name, as far as I know, on an app called Telegram, Telegram. And even then, there are fakers using my name. So you have to look for Dr. Mike Yeadon's solo channel in Telegram. So that's one place. And the other one is a self-publishing app called Substack, one word, Substack. And that's it. So when people snort and say, well, I've never heard of either of those, I say, quite. That's why I'm allowed to be there, nowhere else. So there you go. And I would say to people, before you listen to any of my evidence, no one is paying me anything. I've made it a policy, which I've stuck to, not even to accept expenses on the rare occasions I've traveled. So I've made 0 pence deliberately, and the opportunity cost has been several £100,000 probably. And I'm doing it because what I'm telling you is, to the best of my knowledge, true, and what's going on is absolutely terrifying. Everything's been made up. The country and the West are being de-civilized by parts. And the thing I'm absolutely certain about is the so-called COVID-19 injections are not what they seem. And I know, Charles, we want to return to that. So that's my background. I would finally say I do not claim to know every detail. I've probably said some things that are wrong because I do not have a copy of the script. It's not my crime. I would regard this as me. I don't think it's a medical or scientific event at all. This is a crime event with medical and scientific characteristics, as the Chinese say. And so because it's not my crime, and I can't get very close to the scene of the crime, like the vaccines being made and so on. So imagine how difficult it is trying to work out who did what, and you can't even get to the crime scene or personally examine the evidence. But here's the thing. If what I was saying was not true, given I've maligned people and companies, I would put it to your audience that they would have either sued me or sought an injunction to get me to shut up. None of those two things has ever happened. Instead, what's happened is unbelievable levels of insulting smearing, which when I was not ready for it, I didn't handle very well. And 4.5, 5 years worth of amusing censorship, including modifying search results in main browsers. So if you use Safari or Google and search for my name, you will get largely, Reuters hit pieces and so on. But if you use minority, I don't know if it's the word search engines or browsers, whatever. But if you use DuckDuckGo or I can't remember what the one is I use mostly, begins with Yandex, Yandex, and there are several others. If you search then, you get a massively different set of hits. And I put it again to the audience. Most of us think of search as being a commodity. It more or less does what it says on the tin. You put search title in, hit return, and it should find the most relevant titles. That's not what happens with things that the people I call the perpetrators, because I don't know who they are, but things they don't want you to find easily, they literally demote them. So they're either off the bottom of the screen or they're not returned to you at all. And the evidence for that is if you go to small private browsers, they can't sabotage all of them because they don't own all of them. And I say that if you find very different hits about a topic when you compare Google and Safari with all of the other minor ones, you should have flashing red lights. It means someone has gone to the trouble to change the algorithm in such a way that when these search terms or people are looked for, you don't get the answer, that you don't get the true situation. You instead get the inserted propaganda. So why do people get censored? It's because they're saying the things that the censors don't like. Why do they smear them? Similarly. But from my side, what possible motive could there be? If anyone can find any evidence I've received a penny, I will immediately make a recording and stop talking because it would prove I'm a shill. But I can say that confidently because I've not received a penny from anybody. So what's my motive then? No money. I'm quite a shy person by nature, although I can be socially gregarious when I need to. It's called an extroverted auxiliary, and it's exhausting. I prefer to be on my own with my family or in my workshop fiddling with old machinery. So why am I thrusting myself out here? Why am I being attacked? Why am I not making any money? The answer is because what I'm telling you is, to the best of my knowledge, true, and we are under assault. This is not a mistake. It's not over. And the more you look, the more you see that all the bits are leading towards a very unpleasant end game. And you can put the head in the sand if you like. Not my choice, but I'm not doing it. I want my children and grandchildren to have a slice of the free life I have felt I have had. So with that, that's really, you either believe me at this stage, mistakes and all, or you don't. So it's up to you.
I certainly do believe you. And thank you very much indeed for a really comprehensive foundation to what is going to turn out to be an extraordinary interview in many ways. I would also say that from a UK column perspective, censorship, of course, is something that we touch on a lot. It's a very persistent theme. And I can absolutely testify that searching your name anywhere will really only produce results suggesting that you're a nuisance with a chemistry set who should be put to one side and disregarded forevermore.
If you search Dr. Mike Yeadon, silver bullet, two separate words, for some reason at the moment, you can find that using most browsers. So in that 22-minute talk, there are several slides, as it were, that contain the web addresses where you can find me if you want to. So if I don't say anything else, if you find Silver Bullet, you will have in front of you the resources to research this chap to your heart's content. So that was an important thing to get across.
Perfect. And if you're furiously scrabbling for a pen and paper, don't worry, because that will be in the notes for this interview. So Silver Bullet will absolutely be in the notes. And of course, the other point that you make very well is the fact that you are not being pursued by people wanting to sue you or put out injunctions. And I think that is something absolutely worth bearing in mind for anybody wavering who may, and I hope obviously that they will, encounter this interview. Now, a large part of what we want to talk about concerns the pharmaceutical industry. I looked this morning, Pfizer, their website declares that they now have a total of 88,000 employees across 200 countries. You yourself obviously have spent a considerable part of your career working for Pfizer. It would be outlandish to suggest that they are all malevolent people. However, there is a requirement for such a company to achieve profit for its shareholders. What, in your view now, are the motives of those that run pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer being a particular example? Is it just profit, or is it more than that?
On this point, I have to speculate because I don't know. I would say in my career, which was, I don't know, 35 years in big pharma and biotech and so on, I don't think I came across more than two or three like things that amounted to fraud. They were local, they were personal. People bending literally they didn't get the results they wanted, so they literally made them up, and I caught them out. One occasion early in my career, I won't mention the companies. Why would it? Doesn't help you. But basically, I'd allowed myself to be recruited to a position which I could technically have carried off, but for which I didn't have the level of personal confidence and maturity. So I allowed myself to be flattered. I arrived, and within a few months, I discovered that my peer, we were together running this research department, he was cheating. And when I said, I may have a mistake here, but this can't possibly be true. And he said his phrase was, "I won't be carrying the basket, wire basket over my head when the SH1T comes down." Anyway, I was so upset that it was noticed by our mutual boss. The next day, I was invited to a meeting with him, and when I arrived, there was my peer. And I sat down, and this guy looked at me, and we chatted for a few moments. And he said, no one's interested in what you've got to say. I said, what do you mean? He said, the head of R&D already knows. The site head already knows. So because basically they were planning to advance a compound. It wasn't dangerous. It just, I thought it would make people sick, and that's what it did. So it didn't it didn't cause any damage. But it probably wasted $20 million US. And the reason they were going to do it is if they didn't do it, they wouldn't get their share options and bonuses. And because they'd had a failure the previous year to hit their targets, they were worried the site would close. And I remember saying to my boss, I said, I'm not doing this. I said, there's no point in being a scientist if when you don't get the answer you want, you just make it up. He said, what are you going to do? I said, I don't know. I left his office. Anyway, I resigned, and I was at the time 31. I was the only breadwinner. We had our first child who was a prematurely born baby. So to those who say, I can't speak out, I've got a mortgage, it's like, I could not have stayed. I wasn't being brave. I couldn't cope. I knew I couldn't work in a place that was just riven with fraud. That was the worst one. There were a couple of other minor examples, but here's the thing. I never came across anyone who was intent on evil. And I think most of the people like me joined this industry because honestly, to be paid to tinker with chemicals and biologicals and petri dishes and test tubes, as my wife would say, we didn't use those, but that was her idea of a lab. To be paid to tinker and do experiments and come up with ideas and talk, I like talking. It was a wonderful career. And what we were trying to do was understand how bits of the body work. This was respiratory analogy. When it went wrong, why that was, and what you might possibly be able to do about it to make things a bit better without harming people. That's drug R&D. That's all we ever wanted to do. So we'd be discussing pathways and what drugs do and so on. There were the odd, as I say, people who were either they weren't interested in that very much the money. But to your question, it's probably not going to be a popular opinion. And I hope people don't think I'm protecting the industry, because I think they are on this occasion the tools of even more powerful people, basically the moneyed people. I think using the pharmaceutical industry and doctors generally had been trusted by people was a great way to be able to basically access you and your health condition and your arm in the end. So yeah, they're not innocents. They all of these big companies, as we know, have had scandals where they've been found out to have been continuing to sell a drug after they knew it was harmful. I'm afraid it's happened to every one of them. Pfizer, I think, has been subject to the largest aggregate criminal fines for misconduct like that. So I'm not saying they're in the slightest innocent. I do not think the drug industry thought up this plan and then sprung it on the world. That's not what happened. I don't know who started it, but ultimately came down, I think, through the owners of capital in the world decided what to do. It took a long time running up to it. There's loads of evidence of rehearsals of lots of components of what has happened, and pharmaceutical industry were an ideal vehicle. So that's what I would say, Charles. They are involved. I don't think they were the authors.
Going back into those that were working alongside you, specifically at Pfizer, and as you say, they have over the years accumulated an enormous tally of fines and various out-of-court settlements and all the rest of it. If you can sort of cast your mind back then, and I think I just prefix this by saying, I think we are all guilty at times of being quick to judge from a certain perspective, but actually not necessarily giving the benefit of the doubt. But if you cast your mind back to that time, for example, the Bextra scandal in 2009, how does it feel to be part of an organisation that has done that and effectively, like you say, knowingly conducted criminal activities that can ultimately lead to harming humans?
It did. Lots of people, as a result of the decision to continue selling this so-called COX-2 inhibitor, I'm sure a number of people died. I couldn't tell you how many. That was a cold, calculating decision. How did it feel? We were beeping furious. Honestly, people who work in research and development, 4,000 or 5,000 miles away from HQ, having nothing to do with marketing decisions or anything like that, we were not happy. Should we all have resigned? I don't know. If you work for an oil company, should you resign after an oil spill, especially if you feel they cut costs and allowed that to happen? It's very difficult. Knowing what I know now, what I can tell you is this. I don't mind having been fired by my biotech clients. I would not accept a commission now to work in any part of this industry. Not because the people who might ask me are crooks. They're not all crooks. But because I now understand, sort of constitutionally at its highest level, these companies are ruthless and will do whatever it takes to maximize their profits, even if it hurts or kills you or your children. That's not the same as like pretending not to notice. I think it's much more active. It's much more active than that. And because I think the phrase is to be a normie. Until 2020, I was a very middle of the road person. I watched the BBC. I listened to Radio 4 for 41 years in the morning. I get a thick Sunday paper every weekend. And I don't think it ever occurred to me that I wasn't being told the truth. No, if you're not prompted to ask, why are these news items being presented to you in this way today? Because the first time you're asked that, you think, well, because those are the most important things that have happened in the last 24 hours. It's like, really? Is that what you think? So I had never questioned the industry. I thought, for example, with these fines, that it would have been a sales team, a project manager, perhaps, and a board member, and they'd all said, look, this is what's happening. If we fess up, we're going to lose out on 5 billion of sales, but it might not be real. Maybe if we did a bigger study, it would go away. People can persuade themselves of all sorts of stuff. And it's like, okay, continue. And let me give some thoughts as to how I will summarize the current situation to the board. Before you know it, there's a full-blown conspiracy that involved no more than a bit of selfishness and target orientation. So that's what I thought had happened. And I think partly I thought that had happened was that if it was more systematic than that, and I didn't give any thought to that, but had it been, it's like, why wouldn't there be many more criminal activities? There were two big ones while I was there. 2009 was one of them. But I was there 17 years. It turns out they were being fined every few months for misleading advertising or promoting something outside of the label. I just thought it was like hyper-competitive salespeople's behavior and people who are meant to be in charge of them really not exerting themselves properly, and occasionally like board members just looking the other way. Plausible deniability. I have no idea how many people in any of these companies have even as much knowledge as I have, because I've done nothing else for 4.5 years, and without bragging, I was quite good at my job. I was. My boss used to say I had a remarkable facility of joining finding patterns in sparse data before other people did. It's like, how did you know that? It's like, I don't know. I'm probably working models in my head, and then suddenly things come together, and I think, oh my God, that could be it. I write down other possibilities and pursue it. I was wrong mostly. We're all wrong mostly in science, but I was right slightly more often than my peers persistently. And that's what has given me the ability to look at this stuff. So I'm fairly sure, I won't bother to name them again. I have named people who were former colleagues now in public health, and I've named them. I accused them of saying things that weren't true. I named some examples and said, look, if I am wrong, you need to correct me or sue me. But no such thing happened. So those people, I think, I would credit them with being very bright. You don't get to be that senior if you're not very bright. Do they know what the big picture is? I don't know. You don't need to. The thing about this assault on humanity, which is what it amounts to, is you only need to do your bit, and then all the other players do their bit. You need hardly anybody to understand the overall thing. So if you're manufacturing these so-called mRNA-based vaccines, nobody in production has any idea of what it is that's being made. The computer is telling the synthesis machine what sequence to make, and then it's being purified, bottled, labeled, packed, and so on. I wouldn't blame anyone in production for what happens subsequently. It looks just the same as all the other biological product liquids production. People in research, if I had been there, I bet you I'd not have spotted it, because it would have been done in the vaccine department thousands of miles away. They wouldn't ask me. I wouldn't have thought about it. So it's quite. I have said to people, I think it is possible that you could have no more than about 2 people, probably a lot more. You need to have the CEO, probably the chief, whatever it is, legal counsel, a couple of others, and also the person who designed the damn thing, someone like me. You only need 1 or 2 people. That's all you need. So the idea that half my former colleagues know they've been attempting to injure people, and that's obviously not plausible. I've never said that, and I don't think it's likely. But I will say I have spoken to at least 3 former Pfizer colleagues, all of whom are now retired, and they've all said, you're quite right. It's horrifying, isn't it? So I haven't encountered anyone who has looked at what I've said or what I've written or said a rebuttal. And if I'm wrong, it would be trivial. Why haven't 200 well-qualified scientists, written a dismantling of this madman Yeadon's suggestions? No one has done so in 4.5 years. But I've been smeared and censored. So I've not been injuncted, rebutted, only smeared and censored. And I think it's respectfully because I'm correct. Why they're doing all of this, I don't really know. That would be total speculation. But that you have been frightened deliberately, and the end game has included getting most of you to roll your sleeve up to receive an injection. That there's no question that's a thick part of what's gone on. There'll be loads more I'm not aware of, but it's in my, as they say in America, it's in my wheelhouse. I'm not wrong about that. Please don't get injected. And with these mRNA shots, more are being manufactured. They will also be ineffective, unnecessary, and dangerous. So that, if you take nothing else from this interview, go and watch Silver Bullet and see if you really feel like having another injection.
Mike, such a useful insight into the effectively the microscopic level of conspiracy required in order to create an extraordinary effect, magnified and multiplied so many times. I think that would be very useful for people who obviously don't have your background and experience. Now, you made a very important point about connecting sparse bits of data. And in some of our email correspondence, you related an extraordinary story about the inadvertent or apparently inadvertent creation of dioxin, which of course is the active ingredient in Agent Orange, used to devastating effect as a herbicide by the Americans in Vietnam. Before we go into the details of the mRNA platforms and that side of it, will you just describe that story and how it turned out?
Yep, I will. So there were industrial plants around the world that basically they make things and they combine ingredients. So you add A and B, boil it, whatever. It's a joke. You add A and B under controlled conditions and get C with other impurities and the remaining A and B. You have to purify product C, and then you add it back into a new clean vessel and add C to make E, and so on. It's called a multi-step synthesis. It's quite expensive. The industry is very good at doing that. And just occasionally, despite all their best efforts, something goes wrong. So they don't like reactions that produce heat as a product. It's called an exothermic reaction. And in a place in, I think it was Seveso in Italy, some chemicals were being synthesized. And it was one of these reactions that gets hot. When you add A to B, it gets hot. And they lost control of it, and the plant blew up. And in the heat of the reaction and then the explosion, a chemical called, I think it's 2378 tetrachlorobenzodioxin, better known as dioxin, was formed. And these are polyaromatic structures. So you might remember benzene is like a hexagon with a circle in the middle. That's how it's represented. And these structures had several of these benzene rings, and those are almost always toxic to living things. And so dioxin is like a variant of that, blown up in kilogram quantities and blown across the country. And over subsequent weeks, months, and years, we learned quite a lot about how unpleasant this material is. So it was a teratogen. It caused stillbirth. It produces spectacular derangement of the skin, often on the face and the neck, and you end up with a syndrome called chloracne. And in the long term, it can cause cancer. The reason I mention that is two things. One is, while at university, there was at the time a degree course called mechanistic toxicology or something like that. And it was run out of an institute occupied by 3 or 4 professors who had each specialized in trying to work out how it was that industrial chemicals or occasionally drugs had injured people. And they'd come up with about 15 separate mechanisms, from aspirin to dioxin and so on. And they were chatting and they said, look, we could run a course on this. It would be very helpful to allow people to understand what goes wrong. Because all of these are things to avoid. Things like this should be red flags when you're designing structures and molecules. So I had elected to go on that course. And this was one of the classics of mechanistic toxicology, dioxin. And the reason this was relevant is while I was at Pfizer, so my second big pharma job, I'd been there a year or so, and I happened to notice one of my chemistry colleagues was scratching his neck. And I said, I said, Alex, really saw what's going on. He said, I don't know. Used to have spots as a kid. He's in his 30s. And he said, I've just got this terrible rash. And it's not only me. It's like 2 others in the lab. Anyway, sparse data guy, being my light bulb comes on. Because I thought, well, there's something's going on. I think the next day or the day after, I was reviewing where we were with this program. We were using a series of molecules to try and reduce allergy. And the chemicals that we were using, I looked at the structures because I studied biochemistry. I like structures. Most biologists can't draw chemical structures, but because I'd done biochemistry, I love drawing structures like ball and stick. So I was looking at the chemistry structures, and this light went off, and it was like, they look a bit like dioxin. Right? There was the same basic structure. And my colleagues have got this rash. So I went back to my lecture notes and did a bit of searching. And then about an hour later, I went round to my peer in chemistry and said, I could be wrong. I think you're accidentally making dioxin analogues and they have chloracne. He was like, what? Anyway, within 24 hours, the head of chemistry closed the lab down, taped it up, and assigned me and one other person to take samples, work with occupational health to get these people looked at. And I found a researcher in Holland who was running a bioassay for dioxin-like compounds. And yep, we had invented something that was like dioxin, only more potent by accident. And yes, they were suffering from chloracne. So, of course, the program was closed. And I have to say, to his credit, the head of chemistry, medicinal chemistry for Pfizer, wrote this episode up and published it as widely as he could to warn others. And it's now even on databases. So I make this, I tell this little story because I've said in my talks that when I looked at the structure, the design of these so-called vaccines, I put it to you that all pharmaceutical drugs are made by someone choosing to add a molecule here or not. It's all the result of choices. Everything in the bottle or the tablet or the cream is there because someone chose it, and they chose it for a reason, to stabilize it or to help it be absorbed or whatever, to change the potency. So I was looking at the structures of the vaccines just like I looked at structures of molecules like 30 years ago. And I could immediately see several ways in which I would expect these injections to hurt you. Didn't spot all of them, but having that mechanistic toxicology background, being in the drug industry for 30 plus years, means I can virtually look over the shoulder of the designer and think, what were you trying to do when you designed that like that? And so as a consequence, I was fairly sure by the end of 2020 that I would expect blood clots, heart injury, certainly blood clots in the brain. And I thought there would be impacts on fertility. And I only got about a tenth of it, but those things I was sure of. And so with a German public health doctor, Dr. Wolfgang Wodarg, we wrote, at the time, the largest scientifically rational reason why you shouldn't approve these. So we wrote to the regulator saying, please don't approve these. This was before they were even authorized, because we are worried people will be harmed or killed. And within 24 hours, my life changed. Censorship went from being a little annoyed with me on Twitter to the BBC. Emma Barnett, someone senior from the Royal College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, who to this day should be ashamed of herself, came on, and on a Women's Hour program they recorded, and Emma Barnett said, I'm so furious with these conspiracies. I am going to name him Dr. Mike Yeadon. He's telling lies and misinformation. And then this other lady from the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists said, no, he's absolutely wrong. They're perfectly safe in pregnancy. Indeed, you must take them. Right? That's how much my life changed in 24 hours. And it never got better. But yeah, I was beeping cross that day when one of my daughters sent me this interview on Women's Hour. Anyway, so I wrote them a blistering message saying, if you don't withdraw that, I'm going to sue you, because several of the things that you've said I've said, I didn't, and other things you've said I've said that are wrong are indeed correct, and I can prove it. You've got 24 hours. They took the segment down, ladies and gentlemen. They took it down. I probably should have sued them, but, I'm just an ordinary guy. I don't want to sue anybody. Also, I'd probably make lawyers rich and lose 18 months of my life. That's what I guessed. So I thought, I'll just keep speaking. So anyway, yeah, thank you for asking that prompt question. I can claim that I think I'm the most qualified, former pharmaceutical research person in the world speaking out. Doesn't mean I'm right about everything, but this is my field of expertise since I was an undergraduate all the way to my 60s. I'm not wrong. We said this would happen before the injections were rolled out. That and more did happen. And I'm still smeared, censored, not injuncted. Make your own minds up. It's like, don't let them do this to you, and be aware that the injecting you, is all part of many other things going on. But for more details, go and do some non-Google searching, and maybe stick me on in the background, even if you think I'm a lunatic. You might find it amusing.
Well, I think this is a key thing. Obviously, there's not time now to explore every single avenue of detailed research that you've gone into and that exists out there. But the reason I asked the question about dioxin was that it elicited presumably the correct response by protocol, which was to observe the fact that safety was a concern. Now, you've stated that the mRNA design of vaccine was specific in order to injure, kill, and reduce fertility. In sort of summary form and layman's terms, how is it that you've come to that conclusion specifically?
If I communicate nothing but why, that will be a good result. So people like me, I was quite good at my job, but I'm not a genius. There were lots of people with similar experiences, qualifications, and skill sets and so on, including my peers, whoever it was that designed these things. It wasn't someone in a bank. It would have been someone with pharmaceutical R&D experience. So that means over time, people like me know the kinds of things that you must avoid. They're kind of classics of toxicology, things that have gone wrong, either in an industrial context, like I said, or like thalidomide, something allegedly for morning sickness, and it ended up causing birth defects, people not having limbs and worse. So there's like a little book of these things that you must not do. So given that little book of things you should not do, let me name 3 things that are testably, or you can ascertain these for yourself. And they're all in these injections, and they're, someone like me, anyone like me would know that you would not allow any of these 3 things to be in your damn product. And no one else along the way would allow it either. Number 1, how do you think your body plays nice with itself? I feel healthy and well today, but if needs be, your immune system is able to turn on interlopers and defective things in your body and save you. You get a swelling if you get bitten and so on. Your immune system defends you from single cell cancers very often. And what is the answer to that question? Your immune system is trained to play nice with everything in your body that's meant to be in it. So when you were growing in your mum's womb, your immune system was shown every molecule, as it were, in your body. These are all, Mike, you can tolerate. These things are fine to find inside your house. And any of the random cells that you had at birth that didn't like you, that attacked you, they were deleted. It's called clonal deletion. It's a really clever system. That means when you're born, your body has enormous immune diversity. It can recognize pretty much anything that's outside that's big enough, not foodstuffs, but anything else, as foreign, but it'll play nice with yourself because it was trained to recognize when you were being born. So it follows that if you inject someone with a piece of genetic code, and the instruction is to your body, make this foreign protein, that means your body will be manufacturing non-self proteins. There aren't any products like this, ladies and gentlemen, because that's autoimmunity on a stick. If you had an organ transplant and they got the tissue matching wrong, your immune system will kick it out of your body and you'll become very ill and they'll have to do a rework, take it out. So that's essentially what's happening on a cell-by-cell level. You inject a person with a code for a bit of protein that is not part of you, that is foreign or non-self, you will attack it, whether it's in your brain or your kidney or your eyes or whatever. So that's number 1. But that's what all of these so-called vaccines do. So I remember the first time I heard it, I thought, they can't actually be doing this. You will induce autoimmune attack. Obviously, some people say, well, I've had it and I'm not dead, so therefore you're wrong. It's like classics of toxicity is the toxicity you and I experience for a given thing we take will depend on your susceptibility. So some people are more susceptible. Some people's bodies would have made more of whatever that thing was that they were coded to make than others. Some of them would have removed it more quickly than others. It anatomically will land in different parts of your body. So I would expect a range of outcomes. And what I've described, which is induced autoimmunity, fits pretty much the enormous range of different adverse consequences because they're the same biological process occurring in loads of different tissues. So if you got more of it in your eye than other people did through the blood supply, you could go blind. Other people might not. If it concentrates in your heart, you could have a heart attack or myocarditis. If in the brain, Guillain-Barré syndrome and other neurological deficits. If in your womb, you might miscarry. If in your ovaries, you may become infertile. So it's so obvious. It is what's called Immunology 101, first lesson of first term. And there it is. That's number 1. Number 2 is I no longer think this is valid because I'm not happy about any vaccines anymore. But let's pretend for a moment I would say you wouldn't design a vaccine to contain or to introduce into the body something known directly to be toxic. You would look around and think, what's characteristic of this alleged pathogen that's not directly toxic, but is like obviously, foreign? And we'll get the immune system to train on that. But what did they pick? They picked this alleged spike protein. And there's loads of scientific literature that says that proteins like this, so I don't know where it came from exactly, because I don't believe there was a virus, but there is a sequence, and sequences like that are in GenBank and various protein databases. They're all injurious to mammalian cells. So it's like, why did you pick that one? Well, the answer is they wanted to harm you. And the third one, which is devastating, most drugs are formulated in some way to protect them from the environment. You can't just have a speck. It has to be in a tablet or a cream or an injection, as in this case. So these are the mRNA shots were encapsulated in something called lipid nanoparticles. And I was aware of them, I hadn't worked in them. And as I was searching for background on this stuff, I came across a paper, I think it was 2012, and it was well known in 2012 that encapsulating biological drugs using lipid nanoparticles had the property of depositing, not all of it, but preferentially depositing the payload in the ovaries. So if you combine the first bit I said, that injecting non-self will make your body attack every cell doing the instruction, and the other bit is lipid nanoparticles will steer a disproportionate amount to your ovaries. So it does sound very Bill Gates, doesn't it? It does, doesn't it? And there was no public health emergency except that created by government lying and fear. It wasn't a pandemic. And yet, a year later, whatever it was, over the next year or so, 5+ billion people on the planet rolled their sleeves up and received something that I will say in a court of law were designed intentionally to injure, harm, and reduce fertility. I don't know how much. I've never made a claim for the number of deaths. I can't possibly know that. But that's their property. They can't be helpful. They're designed to injure. Anyone with my skill sets would know that any one of those three things would not leave the meeting room. But you always have like a pre-launch before you even get into development, meetings, and we're pretty hard on each other because there's no point, like with that early job I described, if you ignore fatal flaws, get bitten in the bum later at the cost of lots of money, your reputation is in the toilet. It's better to say no while you can change it, and never accept something that you think the only time we'll know is when it hurts people in 5 years' time. And there were 3 of them. And there are other cleverer people than me in molecular biology that have found 3 others. I think there's supposed to be this SV40 promoter. Apparently this helps the genetic material be dragged into the nucleus. So not my field of expertise, not molecular biology, but I've given you 3 examples, all of which are completely unacceptable, all of which I think are responsible for part of the injury. And there was no justification. And then, of course, finally, you can't make a new complex product in 10 months. No, you can't. Doesn't matter how much money and people you throw at it, you can't start step B until you know the results of step A, and so on. That if you add up the linear sequence of the unavoidable steps without which you are recklessly flying blind, if you add up the length of those linear steps, it's way more than 2 years. Can't do it in 10 months. So they either had it ready beforehand, which probably wouldn't make you feel very happy, or they bundled it up, not bothering to do any safety tests. But it doesn't matter. There's no benign interpretation for what's gone on.
There isn't at all.
No.
Yeah, quite. I mean, that comes ringing out loud and clear. That's a very clear explanation, Mike. Thank you very much for taking us through that. Now, of course, as you describe, there was no pandemic, yet there was a phenomenal advertising campaign for one, and an even more astonishing one for what was being called a vaccine subsequently. Now, broadly speaking, that was sold on the premise that it would stop you from becoming ill, but also that it would stop you either passing illness to somebody else or somebody else passing illness to you. Now, I know that you, I believe you reject all of that wholesale, but that wasn't your position sort of going into this. Will you just go through the steps that have taken you to reject in effect the the sort of marketing line for vaccines in the first place, or at least specifically
Yes,
the COVID one.
you're absolutely right. We're all It's an interesting thing. I and the audience, I invite you to go along this little journey with me. People listen to me, I think, partly because they can't think of a reason why I'll be saying what I'm saying if it isn't what I think is true. Because there's no advantage to me and lots of downsides. Potentially, I could be Rhino Formula any day. I hope not, but it's not fun doing this. So we all of us started believing what you're told. I don't actually know very much. If you think about it, there's two ways that you know things. One is you've actually experienced it yourself. Maybe it's something you've actually experienced. Like if you know how to grow tomatoes, your knowledge is because you've derived it over many seasons. The other way is someone tells you something and you choose to believe it. That's not knowledge, okay? It might be true, but it could be a story. So if you were told, as I was, that you catch colds from floating submicroscopic infectious particles called viruses, right? You never looked and checked, did you? I never looked and checked. That's what I was told. And so I spent all my life thinking that's what colds and flu are due to, floating in the air, submicroscopic infectious particles called viruses. Imagine my surprise. So this is one of the steps. Imagine my surprise when someone who knew this wasn't true pointed me to the sum total of published literature, peer-reviewed journal articles, going from 1918 to 2023, I think, where people who were ill with things that we will call colds or flu were invited to share air and time with a well person. And this was done hundreds of times. And basically the idea was if colds were transmitted in the air, as I just described, on average, people who spent time with someone with a cold or flu would get ill more often than people who spent time with someone else who was perfectly well. And that's not true. People who spent time with people with flu or cold did not, over the next days or weeks, get ill more often than people who spent the same amount of time with a healthy person. In other words, acute respiratory illnesses are not contagious. Your mileage may vary, as they say, but your belief that you gave it to your husband or you caught it from a workmate, no. Your observation is consistent with the idea of contagion. It's not proof of it. Full proof would come by doing experiments such as I've described, where, it's astonishing to me. I didn't believe it at first, literally, because the story of contagion is so strong that you just think, well, they must have done it wrong. So, but I went, there's loads of different research groups, literally from 1980, over 100 years. It's never been demonstrated. So I'm confident that acute respiratory illnesses, colds and flu, are not infectious in nature nor contagious. And before you react and say, I definitely caught it, it's like when you get a headache, and some of you might get migraines, or when you get chest pain, if you're a bit anxious, maybe even you've had a diagnosis of angina. When you've got your headache or your chest pain, do any of you ask this question? I wonder who I caught my headache from. I wonder who gave me that angina. And of course, you'll say, well, of course not. Those aren't infectious or contagious. They're a derangement of something inside my body. Yes, that's what colds and flu is. Colds and flu are a derangement of your internal equilibrium, airway surface liquid. I don't know exactly. No one knows. What they're not is caused by submicroscopic floating infectious particles called viruses. That is a lie. And I think the lie, it's not a mistake, by the way, because it's observable at any time if you do the research. So I'll give you a couple of other things. You may have heard some controversy around flu vaccines. It turns out that flu vaccines has been known for decades by research organizations such as the Cochrane Institute. I think it's Cochrane, Cochrane. I think they've been bought out recently by billionaires. So I don't think you should bother listening to what they say now. But what they said 10 years ago about influenza vaccines was they have no effect whatsoever on reducing the frequency or severity of flu hospitalizations or death. And that ties in exactly with them not working because the story you've been told is a lie, that they can't protect you because that's not how it works. But they've sold influenza probably tens of billions of doses, tens of billions of dollars. And so where it comes to COVID, that's also definitely true. Even recently, some people were doing these attempted transmission experiments with people who had alleged COVID. That is, they had an acute respiratory illness, and the PCR test, which isn't valid, said they had COVID. And they attempted to transmit the illness to other people, and it worked no more often. People weren't ill more often than when they spent time with a healthy person. So that was the main information, Charles, when I realized that you cannot contagion didn't happen. You could not get transmission of symptoms. So, don't come back at me with PCR tests. Like, if an illness was infectious and you could give it to someone else, all you need to study is the rate at which people who come into contact with you develop that illness. You don't need diagnostic tests. And when they've done those exact experiments from the First World War to last year, it doesn't happen. It doesn't work like that. And so the conclusion is, for me, they're more akin to the derangements that cause headaches and migraines or chest pain and angina, none of which you think are caused by bugs. So that's where I am. I have not done the research for, quotes, all viruses, but there are plenty of people you can follow. But at the moment, as I say to people, it's this lie about COVID, bird flu, whatever it is, swine flu, all that. Those are the ones that are being used to smash our civilization and remove your freedoms and get you jabbed. So I'm not interested in the wider field of viruses that much, but I'm knowledgeable about, because I spent all my life in respiratory, that these things up there, it is lies. You cannot find evidence of contagion, and therefore it's irrational to inject you with something that hopefully will stop you getting, quotes, infected, because that's not how it works. It's a story. And lots of things we know belong to that second category. Someone told you and you chose to believe it. So if you're offended by anything that I've said because it contradicts what you, inverted commas, know, please ask yourself honestly how you know some of those things that you claim to know. Did someone tell you? Because they might have been lying. They may not even have. Your teachers and lecturers, for example, they weren't lying to you. They were following a curriculum. They almost certainly believed everything they were telling you, just like I did. But there are clearly some people who know this is, that they're fooling you, lying to you. But most people who told you things gave you their honest opinion, and if you believe them, but it turns out later they weren't true, it probably wasn't even their fault.
Mike, thank you very much. Now, of course, all that said, the spectre of contagion is a very well-wielded tool with which to engender fear and control, and that's really where all we've talked about in this interview has been pointed. And I think there's a great tendency for people who've been absorbed by this sort of material to concentrate very much on what is perceived to be happening or what may happen, rather than looking at the things that are within one's control within one's own life. Now, I know that for you, that's a very important part of all this. And I think just as we sort of begin to wind the interview up, how have you dealt with your situation now in a sort of psychological and spiritual way? From where do you divine your spirit and strength, and how do you carry on?
It is interesting. I can't really explain why I started speaking out, other than I knew it wasn't right. So I started talking about PCR tests and stuff like that. I don't think I allowed myself to bring the dots together that I've talked about joining till about the summer of 2020. At which point I'd become convinced that, since all the countries in the West that I could see were all doing pretty much the same thing, they'd all thrown in the bin their health emergency preparedness plans, which every country has. They They involve basically stay at home if you're sick. That is, and wash your hands a bit more often. That is pretty much on the back of a post-it note. That's the public health plan. As regards what populations were told, obviously they had extra precautions in hospitals and so on. But every one of the countries, they threw their plan away and they said masks, social distancing, lockdown. Come on, it's not even a word. It's an American word, isn't it? To do with prisons. But they all use the word lockdown. Scandinavia, Holland, England, America. It's like, it didn't take me long to realize that there was a plan that had descended from above the level of nation. I didn't know where it was coming from, but it could not possibly have been decided by the chief scientist and chief medical officer in each of 20 European countries. Give me a break. They wouldn't do those things because none of them make any sense. If you isolate people, they get depressed and sick. People at the margins who require social interactions to kind of keep going, some of them just die. There is psychological work that's decades old that shows that recessions, economic recessions, and isolation are extremely potent stimuli to vulnerable people getting ill and dying, which of course is what happens. So I've forgotten the question exactly, but I was realizing that what we were being told didn't make any sense. I guess in that way. I don't think I've answered the question properly, but. Oh, yes. How did I draw my strength? Yes, I then ploughed on for about another year into the middle of 2021. I do remember I was finding it extremely distressing, really bad sleep, because by then, it injected half the country. And those of us who are watching social media instead of the BBC knew that a lot of people had been injured and many had died. Don't know how many, but many. And they were dying horribly in exactly the ways that Wolfgang and I had said we thought would happen. Just an example, in Germany in February 2021, there was a spate, not a huge number, but poor ladies, but healthy young women between, say, 20 and 50, were going down with cerebral vein sinus thrombosis. That means a bloody great blood clot in the descending venous blood supply. Some of them died. They all had dreadful headaches, and they kind of all turned up within a couple of weeks. And some doctors had said, I've seen one case in my life, and we've had like 7 in the last month. And, that was caused by the injection. It was obvious. So terrible sleep around the turn of 2021, because I did feel at that point, everywhere I looked, if this was like just an operation to change the political system, whatever, from democratic to totalitarian, it didn't have to be done quite the way it was being done. It seemed to me that every choice that was made, they'd picked the most awful and cruel way to do it. And in the end, I drew the conclusion, not common for a scientist who was at the time agnostic, but it felt diabolical, demonic, satanic. That's this black thought. And in the middle of 2021, I described this in an interview. Yes, with a lady in America, Dr. Lee Vliet. I think it was the Truth for Health Foundation. I just gave like a 25-minute interview where I described having like nocturnal visits. I was awoken several times in the night by an intense feeling of evil. And I kind of wandered off around the house so as not to disturb my wife. And on the third night, looking out of the window, all the bits joined in my head, and I could see what was happening. I kind of stopped pretending that it wasn't just a bit bad, it was really bad. And I fell to the floor. And sometime later, half an hour later, I felt the presence of something good. And it wasn't God. And it was really, the message was, get up. Here's like a handful of confidence. Get on with it. That's more or less what it was. And then I thought, okay, well, that's what I've been put here to do, to warn people, to use the skills I've acquired. The unbelievable coincidence of taking a weird degree, which no longer exists, mechanistic toxicology, an odd choice of a PhD subject of opiates and respiratory depression. I mean, that's almost spooky, isn't it, given what happened in hospitals? And then sort of had a career that ended just in time for me to be available. Again, it could just be pure chance. Can't say it's not. Or it could be that I've been invited to do this, and so I'm doing it. And how do I cope? Since that happened, I no longer feel ashamed at all or shy in saying I feel safe in his hands. Okay. At the end of your life, you're not here anymore. Best you can do, I think, is lead the life that you would not be embarrassed to describe to others. I think I've done that, and this has been like an additional effort for me to do. So, the good thing about that is you don't feel frightened. I may be wrong and deranged in the idea of faith, and I'm not a detailed person. If you ask me what's heaven like, I don't know. I'm aware of the divine. I'm aware of something, and I think having witnessed so much that I think I felt and categorized as evil, I find I'm very comfortable with the idea that there is this duality, and you can decide in your life whether you want to notice that, and if you do, I think you'll be drawn to trying to do right things, or at least not to do bad things, because you feel better if you do good things and avoid bad things. So that's how I survive. But I'm not going to do this open-endedly, because it's not because I'm not scared in any way. It's just I got other things to do, and if doing talks like this don't work because digital censorship means I can't reach any new people, then I might as well go and do something else. So I'm drifting in that direction as we come up to the anniversary of 5th anniversary. So that's where I am.
Mike, that's a fine note to end on, and I do hope you will come back because there's going to be plenty more to talk about. Now, you mentioned your Telegram channel and your Substack channel. Could you just remind us of the details of those, and indeed anywhere else that people might find your content?
Substack is very easy. You just type in Substack, and it is an app. It's an online free publishing system. If you just go Dr Mike Yeadon in Substack, I am the only writer using my own name there. Telegram is another app. It's just like WhatsApp, or probably not like WhatsApp. It's a social medium. It's a platform on which you can write posts, and then you can make replies, and they get quite agitated, really. But it's a good place to interact with people. The thing is, it's one to many. You can write something and reach anyone who's following you. I think there's 26,000 people. It's not very many, really. But that's what it is. And that is, if you go to Telegram, and it's an app you would download if you choose to. The fact that it was allegedly written by a Russian, I don't think is relevant. I mean, what do we think? Do we think the apps we're using are nice because they were written by Americans? Nah. So I think you're it doesn't make any difference really where you get the app from. And it's just a one-to-many system that you can sign up to. And I am Dr. Mike Yeadon solo channel, because there are other people using my name and image. I don't know who they are. Telegram admins don't react when I complain. So I urge you don't subscribe to the one that isn't solo channel. And that's it really. I don't regularly post anywhere else. Some people I do think that a lot of my interviews people have posted, others, not me. I generally don't have the interviews because I'm giving them. So usually someone else records them, like a mug. I didn't keep copies. I have got a few now, but a lot of them are on BitChute. So if you go to BitChute, which again is like an alternative to YouTube, Dr. Mike Yeadon, I think you can find like 10 or 20 there. So, but yeah, I would recommend mostly pick the most recent dates, and that's because I made more howlers in the past when I didn't realize what I now know. And I'll still be making mistakes, but the big picture is it wasn't a public health emergency. Even if what they told you was true, you wouldn't smash the world up the way they did, would you? So, it's consistent with there not actually being anything at all. Event 201, it was a tabletop simulation run by a number of people, including Gates, I think 2 or 3 months before the start of this madness. And that was, I think it was like the 10th or 12th of such tabletop simulations since the late 90s, which started in America and concluded with everybody, including China and the EU, being involved around the table. They've been rehearsing pandemics that don't happen for 25 years. They were never interested in treating people. the tabletop simulation always focused on control of information and getting you injected. Does that sound consistent with public health? No. Does it sound consistent with trying to stick a toxic needle in your arm? Yeah, it does. That's what they've been doing. I know it tells, when I realize this, it's like the world isn't anything like what I thought. Sorry, it isn't. You can pretend that it is. If you pretend that it is, they will continue to take all your freedoms away. And that might be all right by you if you're late in life. It's not all right for your children, is it? Or your grandchildren. The way to stop it is if enough of us simply tell each other these correct stories, or at least get away from the lies. Because the people who run this, they operate by deception, because there are so many of us. They need to deceive us. They could just turn up, point a gun at your head and say, look, do what we tell you. It's but there'll be enough people who will just say no and grab the gun. They'll end up with civil war, house to house, everywhere. They're not going to do it that way. They're going to do it by coercion, persuasion, psychological operations, fooling you. So if you know that something that's going on is not true, I put it to you, you have a duty to tell other people, even if it embarrasses you, right? The options are potentially to be thought of as a bit of a conspiracy theorist or to get killed. I think it's like an easy call. Find whatever resonates with you. You don't have to say it's alien lizards. I've never mentioned aliens or lizards. I've no idea if they're involved. But, designed to injure you, and here's some reasons why that is, and it ain't me, it's that mad Yeadon. You owe it to your children to get weaving, if you haven't already, and tell other people. Tell people in the bus stop what's going. What do you think's going on in this country? And they go, bloody weird, isn't it? That's your opportunity. Always use as much cash as you can, for example, because the control people like you to use digital money, because they can see where you are, what you're buying, how much, from whom, at any moment. But if you use a £20 note, they've no idea. So it's joyful, isn't it? So I almost only use cash now. And also, every time you pay cash, especially in a small shop, you go, hey, are you getting a lot of cash? They go, oh, yeah, we only, or whatever. And it's an opportunity. Some people are right down the rabbit hole, some are not. But you use every opportunity until you're a conspiracy theory bore, because there is a conspiracy. There's nothing theoretical about it. It's as soon as there were 1,000 people gathered together, you needed a structure. What are the rules around here? That's normal. Guess what? Do you think they got the best qualified people to run the first 1,000 community, or the nicest person? No. What they got was the person who was willing to do what you weren't willing to do. And that's always been true. Some communities are lucky they had as it were, a benign dictator. They usually ended up with nasty people. As the communities got bigger, other people running other communities doing things that you wouldn't do, and that's why they're in charge, would start fighting each other, killing each other off, and so on. And I think after a while they realized that, you know what, a bit like the mafia, it's like, if we agree where our territory starts and ends, we can probably do these people public over even more thoroughly without watching our back. So now you've got a criminal cartel. And then it grew, and then it became criminal cartels in a nation, and then between nations. And then multinational corporations came about during the British colonial expansion, and now you have a need to have conspiracies between continents. So everywhere is run by people who are horrible, because they are willing to do what you won't do. They always do worse things than you would possibly do. And I think, because I read this somewhere, that around 1880, the secret societies that run the world in this way, by being nastier than you're willing to be, agreed that essentially they'd have a pact, we'll stop fighting each other, we'll never fight in public, and we'll agree these half a dozen things. Basically, we're going to take these mugs, everything. And I think they have for the last 150 years. And I think because computers are unbelievably clever as well as powerful, their plan, I believe, is to control everyone and everything everywhere forever using digital technology if we let them. And in the end, digital money without cash, and its use would be perhaps regulated by having a valid digital ID. I think that's all you need. If you manage to lay that control system, or cashless central bank digital money, digital ID, which everyone will have the same format, that will be editable. Have you had your jab? Have you been good? That would control your ingress and egress from any regulated space. Every space could be regulated, including your front door of your car, shops. It's a genius, evil genius, really, I think. So that's that. I've told people that is my absolute fear, because I'm not going to sign up for a new format digital ID. I've already got 10 ways to identify myself to government: passports, driving licenses, bank account details. I don't need a new digital ID. They need you to have a digital ID, because then they can control you. So I'm going to reject it, however inconvenient it may be to me. And I might regret that statement, but sorry, this is the construction of the human abattoir that they're talking about. Cashless CBDC, digital ID. So please reject it. There's no legitimate reason. There's no legitimate reason to force you to have it. It's only real advantages. They can do what I just described, because once you've got to present valid digital ID before you can go anywhere or buy anything, all they've got to do is say, have you had the latest WHO recommended or mandated jabs, Dr. Yeadon? It's like, obviously I wouldn't have. And say, well, your digital ID has reduced privileges or is invalid, and consequently you can't enter or leave or make a spend. Isn't that simple? Is there anything wrong with what I've just said? There's no alternative to digital money. And if you are required to identify yourself with this digital ID that could be editable, including vax status, that I believe offers, that's what I think they want to do. I think in principle, on paper, it's quite a simple thing to do. People who work in ID tell me they'll never make it work. And I take some reassurance, but it's so simple what I've described. If a non-computer person can describe it as I've just done, I'd love to think they can't do it, but it sounds alluringly possible. Anyway, so that's what I think is going on, and I do ask people to. The thing is, if you leave it to the small number of lunatics like me, when I say lunatics, getting no pay for 4.5 years' work, destroying my own reputation and earnings potential, and who knows, they might arrest or kill me. If you don't do something with this information, there aren't enough people like me speaking out. The perpetrators are completely relaxed about my existence, because I think they know, having driven me into like Telegram and Substack, they know exactly where I am, and they can prevent me reaching more than, say, 0.1% population. I don't care. Right? So I want you to make them care by driving that number up 10-fold, 30-fold, 100-fold, because I think it will work. And if we don't do that, I think they'll succeed. It may take a few years, but they'll do it. And here endeth the lecture according to Dr. Mike Yeadon.
Mike, there's a lot for the audience to go away and think about. Thank you very much indeed. Now, I should say that I would entirely recommend both Mike's Substack and Telegram channels. There'll be notes to those in the links to those in the notes below this interview. Also, to the audience, if you are in a position to support the UK column financially, but you're not already doing so, please consider it, because it enables us to bring interviews of this quality to you. It just remains for me to say to Mike, thank you very much indeed for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Charles. Great. Thank you for using your platform to reach hopefully new people. Thank you very much.